every patient should have the right to medical assistance in dying.
Yet we should be aware of the potential moral issues that also arise with this issue.
The American Religious Town Hall is now in session.
Welcome, friends, to the American Religious Town Hall meeting, where the discussion of religious, political, and social issues is meant to promote the cause of religious freedom and to help us better understand each other. And now, here's your host and moderator, Pastor Jerry Lutz.
Welcome. I'm James Weingartner, sitting in for Jerry Lutz, and we're so happy that you've joined us today. We have an important topic to discuss with our thought leaders, and we're looking forward to hearing their comments on this subject. But first, we'd like for them to introduce themselves to you. John?
Yes, my name is Canon John Peterson. I am an Episcopal priest, and I'm canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, D.C.
My name is Rabbi Dan Levin. I serve as Senior Rabbi at Temple Bethel in Boca Raton, Florida.
My name is Mel Robeck. I'm an Assemblies of God minister who serves the church at Fuller Theological Seminary, where I am Senior Professor of Church History and Ecumenics and Special Assistant to the President for Ecumenical Relations.
Hi, I'm Carl Troval. I'm Professor of Ethics and History at Concordia University in Austin, Texas.
Well, again, it's a great topic and one that we're hoping that everyone will engage in, and we look forward to presenting it to you. The topic is about medical assistance in dying. In 2015, Canada's Supreme Court authorized legislation that allowed medical assistance in dying when natural death was reasonably foreseeable. The clause reasonably foreseeable has disappeared in the newest legislation that will go into effect in 2023. It will now permit medical assistance in dying for those with mental illness. Some doctors already deprive care to severely disabled patients. Others have become less willing to resuscitate those who have attempted suicide. Clearly, such a policy provides significant challenges to a broad range of religious communities. Not only does this move raise moral and ethical questions for people of faith, it also raises questions of equity. While those with means can pursue life extension in various ways, those without means may find themselves pressured to choose a medically assisted death. We'd like to ask our panelists to consider the following. 1, in light of the enormous costs of keeping people hospitalized and on ventilators during the recent COVID pandemic, is medical assistance in dying something that the U.S. should reconsider? Question 2, in your opinion, is medical assistance in dying, even when death is not reasonably foreseeable, theologically justifiable? And 3, does medical assistance in dying encourage or discourage the patient's autonomy? Important questions, and we're going to start with Rabbi Dan.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to see everybody again. In our tradition, there is a fundamental maxim that teaches that human life is created in God's image. So what is it that makes a human being different from any other creature? And that is that each of us has been endowed with the ability to make a moral choice, that we can choose as individuals what path we will choose in the course of how we want to live the course of our lives. And that is from the time that we are little children and we say, no, I won't eat that, to the time that we draw our last breath in many instances. And so I think that the prophet Kohelet in the book of Ecclesiastes sometimes says it better than anybody. There is a time for birth and there is a time for death. And the question is, how is that process of death going to be realized? There is an idea, of course, I think in tradition that we don't choose how we get here, and we shouldn't be the ones to choose how we leave. That there are things that we should leave to the Holy One, and that ought not necessarily be in our power to determine or to divine. But I think that that is an individual faith choice that everyone should be entitled to make. I'm thinking in particular of a member of my congregation, a young woman who, when she was younger, was a tennis star. She played as the captain of the tennis team at Harvard. She ran triathlon. She was an unbelievable athlete. And soon after the birth of her first child, she suffered a stroke. And then recovered from that stroke, and then suffered another stroke, and then recovered from that stroke and suffered another stroke, to the point where after she finally had her last surgery, she was so completely debilitated she couldn't see. This is a woman who had a PhD and was not able to read. She had almost an inability to ambulate, and despite her extraordinary efforts and the incredible strength of her body, she had no life. She was in pain all the time. And she made the conscious decision that I've had enough and I don't want to live this way anymore. And what it took for her, because of the lack of assistance that medical care could give her in the dying process, was, I think, her greatest challenge, because she was not able to avail herself of humane assistance to help her to get where she thought she needed to go. In Jewish tradition, there's a story in the Talmud that talks about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the great sage who wrote the Mishnah, the rabbinic interpretation of the Torah. And he was dying, and his handmaid said, "May the prayers of those below be stronger than the prayers of those above," because she wanted him to live. And then she saw the nature of his suffering, and she changed her prayer to say, "May the prayers of those above be stronger than those below." And even though Jewish tradition would teach that you shouldn't do anything that would hasten the process, it also teaches that if there are obstacles to someone realizing their natural end, you can remove those obstacles. But fundamentally, I really believe that each individual should choose how they want to exercise their moral and their individual religious beliefs. And if there are people who want to make that choice for medical assistance, they ought to be able to make that choice for themselves.
Carl?
Yeah, that's great thoughts. And I want to jump on an idea about impeding death, because I think that one clarification needs to be made, and that is, allowing people to die and removing obstacles in the process of death. I mean, that is one thing that there's no moral issue with that. Some people may have, of course, emotional issues, other issues around it, but to take someone off of feeding or of air, or to allow the dying process to happen. And even an individual in their autonomy certainly has the right to choose not to take medicines or to not to have procedures. I know one man who chose to starve himself. That was his way of saying, that's how I'm going to let go. I'm not eating anymore. And to me, I completely understand that. I think that the other issue, though, is this idea of, is in any way can physicians assist people in actively aiming at a person's death? I mean, allowing to die and aiming at death, it's close, but there is a distinction. And I think, for me, that's a very important distinction, because the question always is the person who is under duress and suffering, are they acting in an autonomous way? In other words, it's so easy for someone who's depressed. I mean, there's this comment here about people who might be mentally ill in some way. Does this person have a full autonomy to make a decision about asking someone to help them die? And I think that's the moral dangers that I'm concerned about.
Ken and John?
Yes, I'd like to just pick up on what Carl was saying, because I've spoken to people in Canada, in the church in Canada, about this program. And one of the things they pointed out to me, and it's also being written about, is that at the present time there is, and I'm going to quote, temporary excludes the whole issue of mental illness. And they've taken 2 extra years, Canada's taking 2 extra years to be able to study this and to find the best way to be able to handle this. So that has not an absolute yet within their context. And of course, the key words here are reasonably feasible, or foreseeable, I should say. And how one actually decides those types of issues is certainly still within the context of what the Canadians are putting together here for us, including the different safeguards, so that a person will be able to have that type of dignity within their context of their death. And I want to say something personally here. I've always believed in the quality of life and not in the quantity of life. That has been something that's I feel very strongly about. And one of the reasons for that is that I've been in one too many Alzheimer's centers visiting people over the years. My mother had Alzheimer's for 25 years. And the last 5 years of her life, she was a vegetable, total vegetable. And I have seen too many people who just simply hang their heads over their wheelchairs all day. And certainly, the only thing that can possibly be said about that is not quality of life, but quantity. And to not enable or to facilitate or to help that life process along, I think is really a terrible mistake. And I think that Canada is really trying to deal with a situation like this in the program that they are now proposing, although it is not a final product yet. So I think that we have to be very sensitive to all the different issues as well as needs of people. And this becomes critically important for any type of wholeness in life.
Dr. Mel?
Yes. There are just an awful lot of issues here, I think. All life is precious. It's something that God has given to us. At least we, people of faith, believe that God has given it to us. You're absolutely right. Within the Christian tradition, we were made in the image of God as well. We understand that. It does allow us to make moral distinctions and so forth. But I find that very often we are far more pragmatic than we are theological or thoughtful about the way things are. And, in our generation, we've been spending enormous amounts of money and time lengthening life, trying to extend the life that we have been given in ways that are sometimes perhaps less than thoughtful. The quality of life goes down in many respects, not always, but quite often. I'm thankful for medications that help extend life. They're very helpful. But it's also the case that we are, in a sense, running out of resources as well. And we've come to the place where we have only so many resources for so many people. And the COVID cases really made that clear to us that what we had was limited resources for the number of people that were coming down with COVID. How far can you extend hospital beds? How many respirators do we need? Does everybody need to wear a mask or not wear a mask? Or when is this vaccination going to be sufficient? What's it going to do? Life is precious. And so we work hard to maintain that life. And then all of a sudden, we have these other thoughts that perhaps we should cut life short because certain things are happening. This person is suffering, or this person has no more ability to understand what's going around him or her. I think, as a Christian, I have to say there is value in suffering, and that doesn't mean that I want everybody to suffer a lot. That's not the point. But suffering does bring certain kinds of things. For one thing, it brings endurance or patience. Paul is very clear on that. And that provides, in a sense, character in decision making and so forth. I was close to one of our provosts in earlier years who was dying of cancer, and he told us that the most significant thing in his life was to learn how to live with the suffering that he was undergoing, and how rich that experience was as he faced God and talked with God every day in the midst of that suffering, that it really brought him a richer and a fuller life. Just one last thing. I would say that when we're dealing with people, for instance, with Alzheimer's, and I have many close friends who have developed that over the years and are, in a sense, vegetative, But we really don't know. Doctors don't really know what's going on in the mind of those persons. It's amazing what happens every once in a while in the lives of those persons. A person who can say, okay, you ask them a question, oh, okay. You know, you don't get much there, but you don't know what's going on in the mind and heart of that individual. I hate to do anything that would cut it short.
Ken and John?
Yes, I would like to present an opposite position that you've just taken in relationship to suffering. And Dr. Jonathan Romaine, he's the rabbi of the Maidenhead Synagogue and chairman of the group Interfaith Leaders for Death and Dying in England, has written this: there is nothing sacred about suffering, nothing holy about agony, and individuals should not be obligated to endure it. A counter to that argument.
Rabbi?
So I think the physician's creed is always do no harm. The question is, what's harm? And I think sometimes the application of care can actually result in doing harm because it extends and prolongs suffering in ways that are not meaningful. And I'm sort of living in the tension that the two of you shared about the meaning of suffering, because certainly suffering can be very instructive. One of the most dangerous things I think a human being can endure is to not be able to feel pain. Pain is instructive, and suffering can also just listen to any of the testimonies of any of our Olympic athletes where they talk about the suffering they chose to impose upon themselves to try to realize their athletic dreams. But at the same time, I think that what makes life sacred is not just longevity. It's not just respiration. It's not just sinus rhythm. What makes life sacred is the quality of our ability to choose our own course. Now, there's a member of my congregation whose husband has advanced Alzheimer's, and her physicians and friends are saying, why do you allow him to continue? And she says, well, I'm with him 24/7, and I know that he has some quality to his life, even if he can't express it. But that's her choice to make. And I think that when she gets to the point where she realizes that he no longer has that quality, we should be able to choose whatever we can to have the most humane way to realize our end. And I've had so many cases that I've seen in my career where family members have watched their loved ones suffer through the end, and they say, I would never treat my dog this way. And I think that when we have those moral realizations that we treat our animals with more dignity than we treat our loved ones, we have questions we need to answer.
Dr. Carl?
This is a great discussion, because I always feel so torn in the middle of this moral argument, because I understand that kind of the key piece here is that it's wrong to kill another human being because they're sacred, and because we ourselves are sacred, it's wrong to even take our own life. And so you have the pro-lifers and they have the pro-quality of lifers, and I don't mean that in any of the political ways. I'm just saying that, and pro-lifers see death as the great enemy, pro-quality of lifers see suffering as the great enemy, and of course they're both enemies, but the thing is that they're both relative to the absolute good of God. And so they're both gifts, and then how can we be stewards with both the quality? I mean, all of you expressed situations in which there's this tremendous struggle, right? Death is not the final enemy, and suffering, right? It isn't either. Right. So it's because the good is life with God. So how do we make these moral decisions that we're not taking people's lives or even taking our own lives, and yet relieving them of any suffering? And so, I'm not answering the question. I lean against physician-assisted suicide because I feel like it's a line that can be very dangerous about who's now going to determine. And I respect the ability of the individual to make the decision, but what about family members who are around a person where there's financial interest or where there's other kinds of interests that go against keeping a person alive or ending their life early through medical means? So those become my fears.
There's so many questions that we face about the volition that Dr. Carl mentioned earlier. At what point does a person have the volition to make that choice. We say that a lot of people don't have the volition to make choices in lots of settings, but this one would be a very slippery slope when you allow people to make that decision. We're going to go to a break and we'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying today's program. If you would like to learn more about the American Religious Town Hall, please visit our website at americanreligious.org. That's americanreligious.org. There you can read about the mission and history of the program, learn about the Town Hall estates, and view past programs by clicking the appropriate menu buttons. Each week, Pastor Lutz looks forward to receiving your letters. You may write to him at the address shown on your screen. Send your letters to Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. That's Pastor Jerry Lutz, American Religious Town Hall Meeting, P.O. Box 180118, Dallas, Texas 75218. Thank you for writing, and thank you for watching. And now, back to you and today's closing statements.
Again, a fascinating topic, a challenging one, and one that I just don't see any clear-cut answers to, and it's a range of grayness. So our closing comments now, we're going to begin with Ken and John.
Thank you. For my closing comments, I'm going to share with you the positions of two Episcopalian Anglicans, whom all of you have heard of, I'm sure. I would also want to say that I was very surprised when I read their position on this subject. First is Desmond Tutu, the former Archbishop of Cape Town in South Africa. And Desmond has said, people should have the right to choose a dignified, assisted death. Just as I have argued firmly for compassion and fairness in life, I believe terminally ill people should be treated with the same compassion and fairness when it comes to death. He believes certainly in the sanctity of life, but also that terminally ill people should not be forced to endure terrible pain and suffering. Instead, they should have control over the manner and timing of their death. The other Anglican is the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and that is George Leonard Carey. And he has argued for the assisted dying to be lawful, saying that such a move would be, and listen to this, profoundly Christian and moral.
Thank you, Ken. Doctor?
I think that many people today fear dying, which is why we spend so much time and money on extending life to try to keep it at edge. It is an enemy. We're all aware of the fact that it's an enemy. But especially I want to say that people without a faith tradition, without a real clear understanding of what happens now when they do die, I think are in much more difficult position with respect to pain and suffering and dying than people who have some kind of faith tradition that helps and encourages them. My wife saw that time and time again in her hospital care of people who were in pain and dying. But I have to say that, you know, we have ways of helping people die. I mean, hospice is there. They provide the kind of care that is necessary, comfort care, if you would. But they do not facilitate the death of an individual. I'm far more comfortable with that as a moral oughtness, if you would, than to say, well, I'm going to make the decision, as some doctors do, I'm not going to try to revive this person who, because they tried to commit suicide, there's no need in messing with that. I think we get too pragmatic in our mechanical age.
Thank you. Doctor?
I have a friend who's a physician who said that he wished that the Christians that he deals with actually had a better sense of death. He said, you hear all the time about the resurrection, and yet people still haven't grappled in their own personal life with death. Because he said so much pain could be avoided had people made the decision to allow their loved ones to die or to allow themselves to die, do not resuscitate, all of that, rather than going through expensive procedures trying to save a life that ultimately, probably at that moment of whatever happened, I mean, obviously this is a very contextual decision, but to accept death when it comes. I mean, I've really rethought in my own mind, like, what is the point in which I'll say, I really don't want you to take me to the hospital. Just let me have this heart attack, right? I mean, my wife and I have had this discussion, right? We've said, you know, hey, when we're a certain age or a certain ability, we just let the natural process take care of itself and let us die, because let us go be with the Lord. So I just want people to think deeply about death and what it means.
Robert?
I concur with everything that's shared and the tension that we have between these different moral points. But I think one thing, Carl, that you said is the contextual decision. And one of the things that my religious tradition, and I think all of us really cherish, is the notion of individual freedom. It is in many ways the core of the narrative of our people, is removal from a situation where you get no ability to make choices over your life, from slavery, to be liberated in the wilderness to figure out your path towards the promised land. And my mom is a facilitator of a set of groups called Wise Aging Groups, which is ways for people to come together and talk about the meaning of their lives. And one of the sessions is about death. And she said her group kept putting off that conversation. They wouldn't read that chapter. It took them 5 years to get comfortable. And that, I think, tells you something about where we are in our culture. We don't want to talk about it. But the more that I think we're able to talk about it, the more that we're able to express to our loved ones what our wishes will be in the instance where we do not have the agency to make our own choices. So that we're able to ensure that the kinds of problems, Mel, that you identify, which are real, do not come to pass, but at the same time, we are able to promote the sacred dignity with which we live our lives through to our last breath.
The Charter of the American Religious Town Hall provides that Roman Catholics, Protestants, Jews, educators, and others may appear on this program and can declare their beliefs without hesitancy. And the rest of the members of the panel will uphold and guarantee that American right to all who will appear, irrespective of race or creed, so that the rest of the world can see that here in America, we believe in civil and religious freedom, not only in theory, but in reality. And now, friends, until next week at the same time and over the very same channel, the American Religious Town Hall meeting stands adjourned. May the God of all of us bless all of you.